Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Gary LaPointe, a professor of practice in supply chain management at Syracuse University. And with me is Fran Tucker, an associate professor in marketing and supply chain and co-director with me of the Salzberg Award and the Franklin Program in Supply Chain at Syracuse University. This presentation today is part of the 71st Annual Salzberg Award and Lecture Program. And this webinar is the second in a series of webinars that are going to take place over the next several months. We'd like to also mention that this year's Salzberg Award was fittingly awarded to the global supply chain professional, given all the supply chain related issues that needed to be dealt with throughout this pandemic. We felt this was the most appropriate this year to make that award. So we have a very interesting and informative presentation today on the new USMCA agreement that has replaced NAFTA, or at least changed parts of NAFTA. And we can't cover all the specific changes, and Fran is just going to give a brief summary of the specifics of this presentation.
Hello. I'd like to say welcome back to those of you who've been at Syracuse before, and welcome to those of you who are new to Syracuse. Now, USMCA replaces NAFTA, and there are differences not just in the name. And just to give you a little bit of background, in the US, it's called the USMCA, US, Mexico, Canada Agreement. But in Mexico, it's called TMEC. TMEC stands for, in my very best high school Spanish that I can remember, Tratado entre México de Estados Unidos y Canadá. And in Canada, it's called Canada-US-Mexico Agreement, CUSMA. So you need to be sensitive to that if you're working on USMCA issues. The focus today is on physical products that will be traded between US, Mexico, and Canada. But for more specifics on the new things that came out of these agreements or this agreement, go to the Office of the US Trade Representative, because you'll see that there is intellectual property protection, digital trade, services industries, including financial services, prohibitions on currency manipulation, labor rights, including collective bargaining, and environmental protections against trafficking of wildlife, and also addressing air quality and marine litter. So many of these were never considered in NAFTA. So now what we'll do is, shall I hand it back to you, Gary, or hand it on to Robert?
No, all of us, thanks a lot, Fran, appreciate it. And what I'd like to do now is introduce our speaker for today. Robert Stein is with Mohawk Global, and he is the Vice President of Trade Compliance at Mohawk Global Trade Advisors. Robert is an expert on trade compliance, Incoterms, among many other topics related to trade. So Robert, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I'm hoping that I can provide some useful information and enlightenment on the differences between USMCA and NAFTA. A lot of people had questions. I think a lot of folks were struggling with NAFTA on its way out in terms of how to utilize it and how to properly qualify goods. And USMCA, of course, came along and changed a lot of things. So today, what we'll talk about is many of the changes, and we'll do our best to save some time at the end so that if people have specific questions that come up as a result of the material that we cover, that you'll have an opportunity to ask those questions and get answers. Any questions that we cannot answer in the time allotted, we will certainly make sure that we get answers to everyone. So please type your questions into the question and answer section of the Zoom meeting, and we'll do our very, very best to get to everyone's questions. So with that, I'd like to jump right into what is USMCA. And this, again, as Fran pointed out, it's called the CUSMA or CUSMA up in Canada and TMEC in Mexico. And basically, this is the replacement for what we knew as NAFTA. We had many years. I think NAFTA was first brought into play in 1994. It was the governing trade agreement between the three countries for that time. And the world of trade changed and the agreement really did not. So USMCA is the agreement that now assists these three countries with facilitating trade in the North American region. USMCA came into effect in July of 2020. And what I did here is I made a list of the changes. And of course, there's lots of changes that came into place, but these are the changes. And I have another slide which has a continuation. So we're going to talk about all of these things, things like higher de minimis levels, which is the low value entries for Canada and Mexico, free trade claim certification. We're going to talk a little bit about product specific rules, regional value content rules, things like transshipment, moving goods through other countries that are not USMCA countries. A little bit of a discussion about U.S. goods returned and maybe one of the ways in which USMCA can really help companies that were dealing with problems related to U.S. goods returned. So we'll talk more about that. Some new information on sets, which are groups of articles put together. Things like, for example, dishes is a good example of sets. Recovered goods, which are goods that are basically parts of other things and they are recovered and reused or recycled. Big changes to chemical rules. And then another de minimis, not to be confused with the first one, a de minimis content rule, which talks about minimum levels of foreign goods that can be put in to finished goods. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. We'll explain it in greater detail. And then we'll talk about the automotive and textile rules. And many folks have heard about some of the changes to the automotive rules, which was an effort to increase production of cars, not only in North America, but more specifically to encourage production in the United States. Excuse me. So let's talk about some of these things in greater detail. And the first thing, the one that kind of jumps out, is the low value shipments where no entry is required. These are what we call de minimis. I apologize, there's actually a misspelling in there. It should be DI. So higher de minimis levels for low value shipments to Canada and Mexico. So many folks know that the de minimis level in the US increased from $200 to $800. And that's a really high level. And the hope was that, I believe, that Canada and Mexico would follow because they used to have extremely low de minimis levels. They did raise them, as you can see here. Mexico raised it to 117 US dollars for duty-free and $50 US dollars for tax-free handling. And in Canada, it's $150 Canadian for duty-free and $40 Canadian for tax-free. Now, this is not even close to the $800 limit in the US. However, these numbers are significantly higher than the previous levels they allowed. So it's progress, and this is built into the provisions of USMCA. Listed at the bottom is the actual notice from Canadian Customs, CBSA. That's the Canada Border Services Administration, and they put out a customs notice 20-18, which deals with de minimis levels. So if you're shipping to Canada or Mexico, a little bit more leeway on these low value shipments under USMCA. Recovered goods were put into USMCA in an effort to help the remanufacturing industry. So specifically, there's a lot of automotive companies that take things like brake calipers and starter motors, and they remanufacture them. And this was an effort to allow people to take recovered goods and incorporate them into remanufactured goods. And what this does is it encourages trade and production of remanufactured goods within North America by allowing these recovered goods to become to get duty benefits under USMCA. So there's a huge industry that takes these, in many cases, like I said, automotive goods, and then recovers the cores. If you've ever done any work on your car and you had bought a brake caliper, they ask you to bring the old one to them. Well, that old caliper might have been made in China or Japan, but once that is recovered from a used automobile and it's put through the remanufacturing process in North America, it can now be covered under USMCA. So this should really help that remanufacturing industry within North America. Now, chemicals was another area where chemical companies complained that NAFTA didn't do enough for them to make their chemicals competitive with other chemicals from outside of NAFTA countries. So they made a really big change to chemicals by adding some chemical rules. And these are 8 individual rules that you can actually qualify your chemicals under, just under the chemical rules. You don't even need to get into things like tariff shift or regional value content, which we'll talk about. But the chemical rules, basically, if something is made through a chemical reaction that's defined in these chemical rules, and that chemical reaction occurs in the USMCA territory, meaning Mexico, US, Canada, then the good actually qualifies as an originating good. Now, if it doesn't meet that chemical reaction rule, one of those 8 rules that are in the USMCA agreement, it may still qualify under tariff shift or regional value content rules that are in the product specific rules, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, those tariff shift and regional value content rules for chemicals have been relaxed, meaning it's easier now to qualify your chemicals under USMCA using tariff shift and or regional value content than it was under NAFTA. So chemicals is an area where companies that are in the chemical industry get much better benefits under USMCA than they did under NAFTA. Now, for non-originating materials where there's no tariff shift, okay, that means you might have components going into a finished good, and there's a tariff shift rule for those foreign components, but your input doesn't meet that tariff shift rule. Well, there's a de minimis content rule that says, look, if it's below a certain threshold and it's foreign content and it doesn't undergo tariff shift, it doesn't change what it is, you can still qualify your goods under USMCA. There was a de minimis under NAFTA. That de minimis was 7%. So 7% of the value based on the ex-factory value or the total cost of the good was allowed to be foreign without tariff shift. There are exceptions to de minimis. There are certain things that don't get a de minimis coverage. So that means the 7% under NAFTA wasn't valid. But under USMCA, the de minimis has been lifted up to 10%. So where de minimis does apply, up to 10% of the value of your finished good can be foreign content that does not undergo the necessary tariff shift. Important to note that for textiles, this is based on the weight of the materials and not the value. This is unique to textiles, and throughout the textile section of the tariff, you'll notice that rules that are applied are typically applied by weight of material rather than value. One important note about de minimis content rules is if you take advantage of it, remember that if you're doing a regional value content calculation, which we're going to talk about in a little greater detail, but if you're doing a regional value content calculation, even though the de minimis says you can qualify, you still have to include that foreign content in your regional value content calculation. So it can still have an impact on how your goods qualify, even though they're not disqualified based on de minimis. So here's where we talk a little more about the tariff shift and the regional value content. Both of these are in the product specific rules. So many cases you hear people talking about USMCA, and instead of talking about tariff shift and regional value content, you'll hear them talk about product specific rules. And this is just the terminology they've chosen to cover those Rule B goods. So Rule B goods are USMCA goods that are manufactured in one of the territories of USMCA using non-originating materials, meaning goods that came from outside of the USMCA territory. And a good example might be, again, in the automotive industry, you might have an automobile that's being manufactured in the US, but the engine may have come from Japan. So that's an example of a Rule B good. And the product specific rule can be a tariff shift, meaning goods that shift from one tariff code to another. So taking clay and turning it into a teapot is an example of a tariff shift, because those have two separate HTS or harmonized tariff system codes. They also can contain regional value content. And regional value content is the portion of the goods that is originating. So the value of the inputs that are originating that become the regional value content. These are the goods that don't come from outside of the USMCA territory. So goods that are not made in the US, Mexico, or Canada. Now, the product specific rules can have both. They can have tariff shift and RVC. So both of these may apply. And again, the de minimis may apply subject to those restrictions that I mentioned earlier, which are some HTS codes do not allow the use of de minimis content. Okay. Hopefully that's clear, because that can be quite confusing. I want to talk a little bit about regional value content rules, because this is an area of great confusion. It's important when you're looking at regional value content to check those rules for regional value content in the PSR. The PSR will tell you what those percentages are that are required for your product. So it doesn't matter what you think the amount is. There is no universal amount that qualifies goods to be originating under USMCA. It is in the PSR where it says what percentage must be originating, or what must be the regional value content. Now, some commodities have higher RVC requirements. I think many people have heard about the automotive industry, how they've raised up the regional value content requirement to 75%, whereas some RVC requirements are now lower. And there may be other rules that are in play. So we just talked about the chemical rules, the chemical reaction rules, and those rules are in addition to the product specific rules. We talked about de minimis. We're going to talk about sets and automotive and textiles. So just to be aware that when you're dealing with the product specific rules, they are not exclusive, right? There are other things that may be in play that you have to be aware of. Sets are now explicitly called out in USMCA. Now, this is different because under NAFTA, there was no specific call out for sets. And sets are not originating unless each of the goods in the set is an originating good. And this is important because there are many companies that put together sets of goods in the USMCA territories. And now it's clear that in order to qualify your set for USMCA, each of the goods in the set also has to qualify. So you can't take a mishmash of goods, some of which qualify and some of which don't qualify, and say, hey, this set qualifies because 4 out of the 5 items are qualified for USMCA. So keep in mind that each of the goods must be originating in the set in order for the set to qualify. And the total value of non-originating goods in the set cannot exceed 10% of the value of the set. So this is, again, a call out to de minimis, right, which we talked about earlier, the de minimis content. And that 10% of non-originating content in the set is allowed, okay? But each of the goods in the set, aside from that 10% or less, must be originating. Automotive probably was one of the most affected industries by USMCA. And there was a lot of attention paid to making things more competitive for US manufacturers. So there are a large number of manufacturing plants in the US. There are a large number of automotive manufacturing plants also in Mexico and quite a few in Canada. So the effort under USMCA was to try to level the playing field. So what's different about automotive? Well, you still have the USMCA general certification. So all those things that we talked about with the product specific rules, the regional value content, that's all in there. And you still have to meet those criteria under the product specific rules. And I mentioned earlier that they raised the regional value content for automobiles up from, I think, 60% where it was originally up to 75% under USMCA. So that's the first certification that has to be done for automobiles. Then there's a labor value content certification for high wage labor. And this was an effort to make sure that cars made under USMCA were made by high wage laborers, that automotive manufacturers weren't taking advantage of low wage labor in places like Mexico. So this was an effort to equalize the competitive playing field and also to raise wages for Mexican laborers at automotive plants. So that's another certification that has to be done. And then there's a steel and aluminum certification that must be done to show that they're using the appropriate amounts of US and originating steel and aluminum in the manufacturing of automobiles. And these certifications have to be filed with the USMCA Center in the US, because primarily what the concern is the importation of automobiles from Mexico and Canada. And for 2020, that certification must be filed by the end of this month. There is no timeline yet for future certifications, so they have not yet announced the 2021 filing deadline for these certifications to be done for automotive. So that's the biggest changes in automotive. And there were some changes in textiles as well. So for textiles, you had the yarn forward rule for those of you who deal with textiles, wearing apparel, tablecloths, towels, so many textile and apparel articles. There was always this yarn forward rule that from the yarn forward, the goods had to be originating. And that rule still applies, but there are some exceptions under USMCA to allow greater flexibility. So there are some textile and apparel goods produced using cut and sew, the single transformation method, which may qualify. We have short supply provisions under USMCA, where if you have difficulty getting certain types of fabrics in the territory of the originating countries, that there are exceptions under short supply. And there's something called tariff preference levels, where there has been an effort, and this existed under NAFTA as well, where you could actually get for certain goods a license to bring the goods in, even though they were not qualifying under the agreement, but up to a certain amount, even foreign goods could be brought in using these tariff preference levels from Canada or Mexico. but they had to have a special license or permit. And so there's tariff preference levels built into USMCA as well. And there's a US-Mexico assembly provision, which also provides some relief to textile importers. So if you're a textile importer and you have not looked closely at the changes to the rules, this is another one of those areas where you definitely should look closer and you should be speaking to an expert. I mentioned at the beginning that US goods returned was an opportunity under USMCA. And honestly, and I'm a bit of a geek, I love trade. This is the kind of stuff that really gets me excited because I know a lot of companies import goods under US goods returned. And what I mean by US goods returned is there's a specific HTS code, which we all know and love, called 9801-0010. And we use that HTS code, but with that HTS code comes with the headache of trying to get a manufacturer's affidavit from the manufacturer of the good. So if you're the manufacturer, that's easy. But if you're returning US made goods that somebody else made, that can be a real pain to chase down that manufacturer's affidavit. And also there's a foreign shipper's declaration called the FSD. And that also needs to be obtained because in order to qualify your goods under 9801-0010, it specifically states in the tariff that you need the manufacturer's affidavit and the foreign shipper's declaration. Well, this is the source of endless pain and frustration for importers of US goods, particularly when customs requests these documents and the importer has trouble locating them. But the good news is under USMCA, most companies that are dealing with importations and US goods returned are also dealing with USMCA already. They're already certifying goods under USMCA. And what you couldn't do under NAFTA, you can do under USMCA. And what is that? You can actually put US goods returned on a USMCA certification. And as long as the goods qualify under USMCA, you only need to complete the certification for USMCA. You don't need a 9801 manufacturer's affidavit and foreign shipper's declaration. So we've just eliminated two of the most troublesome documents from the whole process of importing. And we've just basically added one more thing to a document that you're probably already dealing with, which is your USMCA certification document or documents. So it simplifies your internal process. You simply have one process internally to certify originating goods, including US goods returned. Now, this one, I promise you, if you feel confused, I was very confused by this one. So I'll try to take this one slowly with country of origin marking. The country of origin marking rules are still in the customs regulations, the 19 CFR, under Part 102. Now, this is what's different. The goods don't need to qualify for USMCA in order to be marked according to the Part 102 rules, meaning you could use the 102 rules to determine that your goods are marked made in USA or made in Mexico, right? But they may not qualify for USMCA. And the change is that under NAFTA, the goods had to qualify for NAFTA, and then you could use the 102 rules to determine how they were to be marked. So I know it's kind of splitting hairs, or maybe it's a little confusing, but it is one of the things they did is they decoupled the 102 marking rules from the qualification for USMCA. So in this case, you can use 102 even if your goods don't qualify for USMCA, and you can use Part 102 to determine how to mark the goods properly with country of origin. This is one of those places that I definitely recommend a binding ruling. So if you're in the US and you're confused about marking and how I should mark my goods, and you see some confusion here, you should definitely talk to someone who is an expert on getting a binding ruling so that you can make sure you don't have any nasty surprises down the road. A change was made to transshipment rules under USMCA. So this is one of those slides that I hate because there's so many words on it, but I don't really want you to focus too much on the first part, which is A, because what is in A is exactly the same as what was in NAFTA, which basically says, look, your goods lose their USMCA eligibility if you do anything to them outside of a USMCA territory. And then it says other than, and then there's a whole bunch of exceptions. So if you unload, reload, separate goods out of bulk, you store it, you label it, you mark it. These are all things that don't take away the USMCA eligibility. That was how NAFTA read. Basically, you can't take a USMCA good and produce it further outside of USMCA and expect it to get the benefit. What they changed is they added what is highlighted in B. Okay, so what that says is goods lose their USMCA eligibility if, subsequent to production of the good, it does not remain under the control of customs authorities in a non-USMCA country. And that means your goods can transit a non-USMCA country as long as it remains under the control of customs authorities, as long as it does not enter the commerce. So if you have goods that go, and I know this sounds ridiculous, but we'll use it as an example. If you have goods that go from Canada to England to the US, as long as those goods remained under the control of customs authorities in England, it's allowed under USMCA. If the goods are released into the commerce of England in this case, then it would no longer be under the control of customs in England, and therefore the goods would lose their USMCA eligibility. So that's the big change here, is under transshipment, they've added this letter B to talk about what happens when my goods leave the US, Canada, and Mexico. We also changed who can certify a claim. And I say we as if I had something to do with negotiating USMCA. I promise you, I was clearly on the sidelines on this one because I had really good ideas that nobody wanted to incorporate. But they did a pretty good job. And with who can certify, what's different is the importer can now certify a claim under USMCA. And this is different than NAFTA, because under NAFTA, it was the exporter who certified the claim. Okay. Claims can also be certified under USMCA by the exporter and the producer, right? And the only thing is, if you're the producer, you don't have to get written support from anyone else for a certification of a claim. But just keep in mind that if you're the producer, you still have to produce evidence supporting documentation that the goods qualify. And the key thing about USMCA that's different, and I kind of mentioned it already, is that the importer is responsible for substantiating the claim. So even if the importer does not certify the claim, they still are responsible for substantiating it. And what that means is you have to maintain supporting documents, right? You're responsible for corrected claims within 30 days of discovery. Now, that's also new. You have only 30 days when you discover it to correct the claim. And if you're an importer executing certificates for USMCA, there's a statute called USC 592, where you can get a penalty under reasonable care if you don't exercise reasonable care in executing those certificates. So that's a specific liability that's been introduced under USMCA. Now, what has not changed is that everybody's got to maintain records. If you're the exporter, you should maintain records so that if your importer on the other end needs information regarding a USMCA claim, that you can provide that to them. If you're the importer, remember, you're responsible for substantiating the claim, so you should have records of all the things that are required in order to substantiate your claim. And if you're the producer and you're certifying, you need to make sure you have all the records necessary to show that your goods underwent the necessary tariff shift and regional value content to make sure that they are qualifying under USMCA. Now, under drawback, we still have this terrible thing called duty deferral. This happened under NAFTA, and it's still there for USMCA, which basically means if you produce goods in the US and then you ship them to Canada or Mexico under USMCA, you cannot claim the full effective drawback. In fact, you effectively lose all of the benefit of drawback, because there's something called the lesser of two rule, where you can only claim the drawback against the lower of the two duty rates. And since the duty rate under USMCA going into Canada or Mexico is typically 0, that's the rate at which you can claim your drawback against. So essentially, USMCA eliminates drawback for producers of goods in the US that are shipping those goods to Canada or Mexico. Certainly, you should talk to an expert before making that decision that you don't qualify, but it is something that makes it difficult. Production FTZs used to face the same problem under NAFTA. That restriction was removed under USMCA. So technically right now, if you're a production foreign trade zone and you ship goods to Canada, for example, you could indeed claim the foreign trade zone benefit in the US and claim the benefit of USMCA in Canada without paying additional duties. The US Trade Representative is currently trying to push through a technical correction through Congress, which would in fact take away that benefit and make things more like they were under NAFTA. And that would effectively eliminate the ability, again, to claim the benefit of the foreign trade zone for goods produced in the US and then shipped to a USMCA country. So if you have questions about that, I definitely think you should follow up with me afterwards. I'm very familiar with foreign trade zone, but this has a huge impact. And if the technical correction does not make it through Congress, FTZs might have a key benefit to US producers of goods being shipped to USMCA countries. Origin verifications remain the same under USMCA. So when you're getting a verification from CBSA in Canada or Mexican Customs, they can still come to visit you in the US, or US Customs may go to visit producers in places like Mexico or Canada. So that continues to be the case under USMCA. And you do still get a merchandise processing fee waiver. And that is the MPF is the 0.3464% that Customs takes on every entry, regardless if it's duty free or not. But under USMCA, that MPF is waived, but only if it's filed with the entry summary at the time the goods are first imported. Because if you try to do a 520D letter, which is a correction to a USMCA claim after the fact, so let's say you forgot to claim USMCA when the goods were imported, and then you said, oh, wait a second, these goods qualify. Here's my certification. Please correct the entry. The customs broker can correct the entry, but because of the way the MPF waiver works, you don't get your MPF refunded. That waiver is only available right now, at least, when the original entry summary is filed. And again, there is some talk of getting that corrected, but for the moment, it still remains that way. So true or false, the percentage of foreign content is the determining factor for USMCA qualification. This is a very common question we get, is that people will say, hey, my goods are 85% US, so they qualify for USMCA, right? And the answer is false. That the regional value content, the originating content, is not the sole driver of whether or not your goods qualify. The qualifying of non-originating materials is done through, as mentioned earlier, either tariff shift rules or regional value content rules, or both, and or additional requirements. So think about those chemicals that we talked about earlier. You had a chemical reaction rule, or you had a tariff shift and regional value content rule. So these things can be very complex. And so for people who are looking for simple answers, and I understand that, right? When we reach out to an expert and we're frustrated and we just want to know, do my goods qualify? The problem is we can't just base it on a percentage of originating materials. As you can see from this slide, it's a complex analysis, and you have to really break things down on your bill of materials and understand how the rules apply to your finished good. Now, you may be dealing with things like intermediate materials. So instead of buying components from another company who certifies that they qualify for USMCA, you may be under Article 4.8 of the USMCA, you may be able to say, hey, I have some goods that I make into a component, and then I take that component and I put that into my finished goods. So the illustration you see on the slide is the blue circles represent starting components. The yellow squares represent intermediate materials that were made with those raw materials. And then the blue hexagon represents the finished good. And if you can certify that the intermediate materials are originating using the rules of origin, you can then use those originating materials to put into your finished good and then qualify your goods that way. It's kind of complicated, but I call this the double shift rule, okay? They have to be incorporated into a finished good. They must meet the rule of origin, and your intermediate materials may need to qualify for the regional value content rule. So this is a very complicated analysis that you have to do if you think you have intermediate materials and you're really not sure how to handle it. Again, this is where you'd want to talk to an expert, because also there are some exceptions to intermediate materials under certain industries and HTS codes. And you don't want to go through all this only to find out that your goods don't even qualify because there's an exception. There's also conditions for accessories, spare parts, and tools. And these are the conditions here, right? Your accessories and spare parts, tools, they have to be delivered with the goods, right? So think about, again, if you think about an automobile, in the trunk of your automobile, well, most automobiles, is a spare tire and a jack and a lug wrench. And technically that jack and that lug wrench are tools, but it's delivered with the automobile, right? And it's invoiced with it. You don't get a separate bill from the car dealer saying, here's your invoice for your car. We financed that. And by the way, you owe us $75 for the jack and the lug wrench. So it's part of a standard offering. When you buy a car, you typically get a jack and a lug wrench. Now, I know there are some newer cars that have run flat tires, and so there are some exceptions. But typically, this is the example I would use. And of course, shipped in customary quantities and value. So if your car comes with one jack and one lug wrench, that makes sense. If there's 5 of them in there, that's not customary quantity and value. And remember that even if these accessories and spare parts and tools are included under this provision, that you still have to include their value for regional value content and de minimis calculations. Here are some operations that don't confer origin under USMCA. They don't confer origin for anything, actually, but especially under USMCA, if you dilute things with water, if you simply package them, or if you just use production and pricing practices that are designed to circumvent those product-specific origin rules, they don't qualify as operations that confer origin. So be careful and make sure that you're not using these to try and qualify goods under USMCA. And as I've said a number of times, when in doubt, talk it out. USMCA is every bit as technical, maybe more so than NAFTA was. So you want to talk with an expert, someone who can guide you, because the penalties are severe. And especially if you're an importer, you can have a big penalty under 19 USC 1592 for making an incorrect claim on a good that qualifies or ends up not qualifying. So make sure that you're making your claims carefully, that you're doing your work and talking to an expert where necessary. Now, just keep in mind that when you're going to claim USMCA, the goods have to qualify. That's pretty plain. They have to ship from a USMCA country, or remember, if they transship, as long as they don't leave the customs control of that foreign country, they can come from somewhere else, but they have to originally ship from a USMCA country. And if prepared, a USMCA declaration must be properly completed. The importer must possess information to support that declaration at the time of the claim. So you don't have to have a form, but you have to have the information to support the claim. And if you don't have the information to support a USMCA claim and you have goods coming in, my recommendation is don't make the claim. If you're going to certify goods, right, under USMCA, the certifier can be the producer, the exporter, or the importer. You can make a claim on any form. There's no prescribed format. You can make a claim for USMCA on the commercial invoice. Some people put a statement on there. The most important thing is that if you're going to have a certification of origin, there are minimum data elements outlined in Annex 5A of the agreement. There was a handout originally with this, and if people are interested in that, we can provide that. But the key thing is you have to have these 5 data elements, and there's no rejections for minor errors as long as those errors are timely corrected. You also can store certifications electronically. So that's also a little different. Remember, if you were certifying under NAFTA, it was this constant paper shuffle at the end of the year. You can do electronic format of USMCA certifications. Remember that if you certify, it's a legal declaration and you have to support it. You have to decide things like when should it be prepared, who is preparing it and authorizing it, what records you're going to retain, and when and why should it be reviewed. So these are things that you need to put together in a USMCA compliance and validation program, so to make sure that you're following this protocol and only preparing USMCA documents and certifications when they're necessary, and that the people internally who are knowledgeable and authorized are the ones who are actually giving their blessing. So I want to take just a minute to run through this certificate of origin. Now, remember, there is no actual certificate of origin. That was under NAFTA. You had that exporter certificate of origin. There is no official form. You just need the information for customs. So now that I said there's no official form, here's the unofficial form. So this is a form that we created, but a lot of companies have created forms. And this basically has the information that is required in order for a claim to be certified, as long as you have the documentation to back it up. So I know everything's a little small here, so I'm just going to run through, right? You have a certifier field. And remember, the certifier can be the importer, it can be the exporter, or the producer. The exporter, that is the exporter, and its name and address, email and phone number. It's not required if you're the producer and the exporter is unknown. So for a lot of people who would contact people like me and say, what do I do? I don't know who the exporter is. I'm just the producer and someone's asking me for the certification. You can provide a certification where you fill it out as the producer and leave the exporter blank. Okay. And if you are going to show the exporter's address, it's the exporter's address at the place of export. Now, this is a pretty easy one. This is the producer field. So this is the place of production. And if you're the exporter and you have multiple producers, you can just put various in here. If you have a confidentiality concern, you can put available upon request by the importing authorities. So there's some flexibility. If you're the importer, right, you fill out the importer name and address. If you're not the importer, you can complete this here. It's very simple. And if this is a blanket declaration and you're the exporter, you can just put various in here because you may be shipping to multiple importers in places like Canada or Mexico. Just remember in your invoice description that invoice descriptions matter. The invoice description must be sufficient to describe the good to the tariff number, and it has to match the commercial invoice description. If you put oranges on your commercial invoice, you can't have apples on your USMCA description of goods. So just remember, right? I know I'm comparing apples and oranges, but you have to make sure that those descriptions are consistent. And then your origin criterion field, and this is the same as under NAFTA, where you have the different criteria from A through E, and basing your USMCA claim on which rule you use. So we talked about Rule B, which are goods that have non-originating materials in them. There are other rules to qualify your goods. And then your blanket period field, which can't exceed 12 months, covers multiple shipments. And if this is not a blanket certification, you can indicate the invoice number in the from field. Now, this certification did change for USMCA. Under NAFTA, the same wording was here. It basically says, look, I certify that the goods described in this document qualify and that this document is true and accurate. And then under NAFTA, it said, I assume responsibility and liability for proving such representations. And they actually removed the liability. So now it just says, I assume responsibility for proving such representations and agree to maintain and present, blah, 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 all the necessary documentation to support the certification. So it's good news is that the liability piece, that word has been removed. But remember, you're still responsible for the accuracy of this document. If you have a low value shipment and you're not going to complete a certificate and you just want to put a statement on your commercial invoice, you can use a statement like this for low value shipments where it just says, I hereby certify that the goods covered by this shipment qualify as an originating good for purposes of preferential tariff treatment under USMCA, CUSMA, TMEC. Very simple. So what are your next steps under this change from from NAFTA to USMCA? These are some pretty universal rules that we kind of put out to everyone, especially as USMCA rolled out in July. We said, review your tariff classifications and make sure they're correct. This is a great time to evaluate whether you even have the correct HTS codes. And look at those USMCA rules and compare them to the NAFTA rules to see what kinds of changes may be impacting your goods. Now, you want to make sure you obtain certifications to support your origin claim for either materials or finished goods. So if you're a producer, you want to get those certifications for your raw materials. If you're just an importer of goods from not from overseas, from Canada or Mexico, you want to make sure that if you're importing those finished goods, that you're getting the necessary certifications to support that USMCA claim. And make sure to retain your records for 5 years from date of entry, because the record keeping requirement in the US for customs is 5 years. But I will make a footnote here and say, if you are a non-resident importer in Canada, remember, as a non-resident importer in Canada, you are subject to Canadian customs rules. And in Canada, the record keeping retention requirement is something they called 6+ current, which I like to refer to as Canadian for 7. They have a 7-year, I don't know why they don't just say you have to keep your records for 7 years, but basically if you're a non-resident importer in Canada and you're making CUSMA or CUSMA claims for a preferential duty treatment, you're going to need to make sure you keep those records for 7 years, not 5. But for the US, it's 5 years. There's some helpful links here, and I've directed Fran and Gary to make sure that if you want copies of the slide deck, we will make that available to everyone. So you'll have all of the materials, plus these links here will be live so you can click on them. We simply asked, as we share this slide deck, that if people could just remember that we do allow you to have it for internal purposes and training, but please don't use the material on the slides externally, because this material is copyrighted. So at this point, it's 2:25. I think I've hit the mark, Fran and Gary, and we have some time for questions. So I noticed there's a couple questions, and if you want to go ahead and read them, I will do my best to answer them.
Okay. So if you want, I'll take the first question. This is from Gilbert, and he says, do these rules apply to produce such as flowers, vegetables, and so forth?
So yes, there are rules, and preference criterion A, which is wholly obtained or produced in the originating territory, so US, Canada, Mexico, would apply to things like produce and flowers, because things that are grown in a originating territory are automatically qualified under that rule A. And that's because I call it the cows and corn rule. If you grow animals, plants, if you dig it out of the ground like coal, these are things that are wholly obtained or produced, because you can basically say, look, every molecule of this product is from Canada, for example, or from Mexico. So yes, the rules do apply to produce, flowers, fruits, vegetables, anything grown, harvested, or dug out of the ground. Once we start processing it, it becomes a different situation. So if you grow corn in the US, right, but then you send it somewhere for processing, you have to be careful, because if it stays in the originating territory, then it may still qualify. But if you send it overseas for processing and it comes back as a different item, it may no longer retain its USMCA eligibility.
Okay, Gilbert has a follow-up question. It says, how are these rules monitored? And they seem invisible to the retail consumer.
Yeah. So the beauty of USMCA and NAFTA before it is to retail consumers, these kinds of things, you don't even see them. They just kind of happen magically. And where you really see it is you see it in the prices of the goods that you buy. But how it's monitored is the various customs agencies do validations or verifications. And so, for example, in Buffalo, every year for a long time, they would do 100 validations of Canadian supplier NAFTA certificates every year. They would schedule them for the spring after the snow stopped flying, which is what, I think August or something. And they would go up there and they would actually check the exporter certificates to make sure that the claims were valid. Incidentally, a high percentage were not valid, just so you're aware. But the validations are conducted by CBSA in Canada, by the US Customs in the US, and Mexican Customs in Mexico. And they travel to the other countries where parties who make claims or certify claims are located in order to do those validations. So if you're in the US and you make a claim, you certify a claim for goods that end up in Mexico, you could get visited by Mexican Customs in an effort to validate that claim.
Okay, I got one question for myself, Robert. Before earlier, you were talking about sets. Can you give us an example of what you mean by a set?
Okay, so you're in the local sporting goods store and you're looking for the perfect gift for that nephew or uncle who's a big camper, and you spot a beautiful set with a compass, a knife, a flashlight, and probably a bottle opener, because nobody can live in the woods without a bottle opener. Okay, this is a set of goods, right? Obviously, you're not buying it for any one thing in the set. They've been assembled together. And so you have it, it's in a retail package. So clearly you're not buying it for one thing, you're buying it as a kit, right? So in that situation, if you wanted to qualify that set, each of those items, the compass, the knife, the flashlight, the bottle opener, in order for that kit to qualify under a USMCA, each of those items would have to qualify under USMCA.
Got it. Thanks. See, any other questions from anyone?
I saw there was a live question someone wanted to ask, but I'm not sure how that works.
I'm not sure. Well, it doesn't look like we have any other questions coming in, Robert, at this point. Fran, anything you want to add before we close?
No, I just want you to remind everybody about our, both about when this will be available online.
Yep.
And also about our upcoming webinar.
Okay, very good. So with that, we'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. We'd especially like to thank Robert for coming and joining us. As Fran was mentioning, this webinar is going to be published on the Whitman School of Management YouTube channel, as well as the Whitman Voices, in about 2 weeks before they can get everything together and edited. You can contact me or Fran if you have any questions or looking for any additional information, but if you have anything specific that dealing with trade or trade compliance, you can feel free to contact Robert directly. He is the answer man for anything trade related. We also look forward to having you join us for our next webinar, which is going to be hopefully on February 8th. And that webinar is going to focus on mergers and acquisitions in logistics. And we have a pretty impressive panel lined up for that discussion. So with that, we thank everyone for joining us today. And please let us know if you have any questions, contact Robert. And we look forward to seeing you on our future webinars. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.